of build out. And how did I do that, right? So how did I come up with that? I made some key assumptions. One was that I was going to take a look at land use areas and land use districts and come up with an estimate of the acreage. The next thing I did was I took a look at plats, new plats, some of the infill building, and made some assumptions about what the residential zoning acreage would be. And from that came up with an estimate of additional single family lots. Okay, so this image is of future land use districts. It is of the township. And essentially what we want to focus here is on the yellow areas, and to some degree the duplexes, which are in orange, and the multifamily areas that would be in brown. Going through here and figuring out what the acreage is, it's about 3,500 acres that could be built out as future land use being residential. Other colors here really aren't important for residential building. For instance, the green areas are designated as possible park or open green space areas. The next thing was to look at some of the current zoning for Avon. And so this is the boundaries of the town. And the darker yellow are residential zoned, and the orange is also residential zoned. Also looking at infill. And one way we can do this is to go to plat maps and actually drill down to actual lots and see if that lot has been assessed, which would suggest assessed as a residential building, which would suggest that a lot has already been built out. And then lastly, look at new approvals for home building. These are things that I have listed here that are since the last time we did this study or did this update, and that would have been 2018. Some of these are in progress, some of these are already approved. SF would mean single family homes, and DB would be doubles, or TH meaning townhomes. So compiling that information, basically it gets us to approximately 8,000 single family lots that could be built, assuming that the entire township was built out. Of course, there was room left for parks. There's commercial zoning that's not included in this, and other areas of the district that wouldn't be included. We're just focusing on residential. There is an assumption here of 80 homes per 40 acres. So if you made a change in that assumption, that could go a little bit higher or a little bit lower than the 8,000 estimate. What I think is really important here, however, in particular for enrollment, which is what we're talking about, is what is the impact on enrollment, is it's not just the level of building, it's also the pace or timing of building. For instance, the impact of 8,000 homes in 10 years is huge compared to the impact of 8,000 homes in 15 or 20 years. And that's largely because you already have students who are in your schools or about to be in your schools because they're preschool aged. And when that building occurs faster, it really has a significant impact on enrollment than compared to when a building occurs much more slowly. Okay, so in my mind, it's just not the level here that we're talking about, it's also the speed. And the speed is what really drives enrollment. So that's the first thing I wanted to chat about today. So that was the first agenda item. The second agenda item is to talk about an update to the enrollment forecast. The last time I did this for y'all, it was 2018, and when we did that, and some things have changed. One of the things that has changed is we did that forecast for 10 years, and since then, births are actually going down, yet housing has gone up. And those two things have impacts on enrollment in different ways. Fewer bursts means maybe elementary school enrollment might not be as high as we would expect, but more housing, you'd actually anticipate that your enrollment score would go up in advanced grade levels. So the forecast is basically being redone with these new data and the new patterns that we are currently seeing. Also, additional thing that we've done, and this is the first time we've did this is the new piece, is we're extrapolating the data so that we have a 20-year look into the future. And the idea here with an extrapolation is basically saying, okay, we've got a forecast, we've got data from the previous 10 years, and now what if? What if that trend continued into the future? What does that mean? And particularly here, for the activity that we're trying to do or the question we're trying to answer, what would enrollments look like if 8,000 homes were built out? Okay, so that's really that second piece that we haven't done before that we're going to do with the forecast. So you've seen this graphic before, or this was our 2018 enrollment forecast. And I bring this up just to kind of highlight some things. When we're doing the forecast, one is we have this, apologies for this touchy mouse, we have this solid line, and we have the previous 10 years, which is actual data, and we have the future 10 years, and we don't quite know exactly what the future is going to bring or the future is going to be, but we can make some reasonable assumptions and then see what enrollments would be. So we've seen this before, and that solid line going into the future, 2018 forward, is what we often call our base forecast. And then we have a range around that, high or low, based on both birth assumptions as well as housing assumptions. Now, where are we right now with regard to the forecast? Currently, actual enrollments just a little bit higher than what the forecast was. There were some differences, though. Enrollment was higher at high school levels and lower, particularly at kindergarten level. But overall, on a total basis, the forecast did pretty good, even in this COVID times, but there were differences at grade level. The other things that we do know that's going on is births. Births are different. So in the year 2017, we had 1,700 births for Hendricks County residents. All right, so these are moms who actually reside in the county. This is the lowest level of geography also that we can get this data. And at that point in time, when we did the forecast with 2017 births, we actually expected that births would continue to go up, and actually they haven't. So this is births for 2018, 2019, and that's that solid line. Births have actually declined somewhat since then. All right, so an assumption is, a reasonable assumption is, well, what's going to happen in the future? And if you look at this history of births here, now we have 12 years of births, very unlikely, if history's any marker on the future, that it would go back to the peak numbers. This was the highest number, 2007. That was the peak number of births that occurred in the county. Now, one thing that is not here is COVID babies. Matter of fact, one thing that's not here is even 2020 births. All right, so 2020 births will not be available until May of this year, and 2021, which would be COVID babies, all right, children that were conceived during COVID, that data is not even yet available. Those children are newborns, right? They're just starting to be born. So what we know and what we anticipate is that during COVID years, we're actually going to see fewer births. And the reason why is because it's very uncertain times, as well as we have high unemployment. And during high unemployment, births tend to go down. During good economic times, births tend to go up. So that's what we would anticipate also based on current times. That data, as soon as we're going to have data on COVID babies, would actually be May 2022. Okay, what else that we have going on is permitting. Now, you have seen this graphic before. What's different about it, I actually added a couple years. So we're going all the way back to 2000. So we're seeing a snapshot of 21 years of single family permitting in Hendricks County. And you can see at the beginning of the turn of the century, right? So the heavy building years, 2000 all the way to about 2005 were peak building years. Those numbers came down and they bottomed out about 2010, 2011, and permits have since gone up. What is new is permits are not only high last year, historically, we're approaching high levels this year. All right. So in 2020, the numbers, at least countywide, appear to be very comparable to 2006. Now, this is Washington Township, not countywide, but Washington Township. So we're seeing a very similar pattern when we're just looking at the township itself. Again, you've seen this graphic before, but I think this is the first time you've seen it where we're just looking at 2000 and moving forward. In 2020, we're looking at home building at about 550, 560 single family permits. I should say single family permits issued. That actually doesn't mean the house is built yet. The permit has been issued. And that level has not occurred since 2006. This level of building exceeds what's in the current forecast. Okay, so that's another reason for us to go back and say, all right, what should the forecast be? What should the numbers be? What should we be looking at in terms of building, and how can we update that forecast and give you the best numbers possible? So in terms of the forecast range and what's most reasonable for us to assume, we're going to start first with births. The base forecast assumes that births will be fairly steady, like that graphic that I showed you, but births could go up. So we'll make that the high forecast, and births could actually decline, and so we'll make that the low forecast. In terms of single family permits, for the base forecast, we're saying that permits will increase to about 700 per year. And again, right now they're at about 560. So we're increasing the number of permits to 700 a year. At a high level, again, this is just a scenario. We don't necessarily know that this would occur, but at a high level, we're bringing it back to what occurred at the turn of the century, where we're going to about 900 permits a year. And at the low level, we're going to basically take permits and we're basically going to cut them in half. Over time, they slowly decline to about 250. So that gives us a range of the high and the low, as well as a base forecast. We're going to assume that all scenarios could actually support the infrastructure for building out. That actually is a question, and it is not something that's reported here. I'm also assuming that transfer students as well as private school enrollment doesn't change much from current patterns. There are some unknowns, and probably the biggest unknown, and we've talked about this previously as being a big unknown, is resale and resale of homes. What would happen if homes turn over? Well, if homes turn over, let's just say mom and dad live in the house and kids have already gone to college and moved on. And if they sell that home post-COVID, then that becomes another place where enrollment could grow. There's not a specific assumption in the forecast for that. Really, it's not something we know. But if you do believe something like that is going to happen or could happen, then that would suggest we should be thinking about the high side for our forecast, okay? So what does this mean when we run our forecast? What does this mean, these assumptions mean? So again, we're going to see graphic very similar to what you've seen in the past with going back 10 years. So that's a number of 8,500, which was enrollment at 2010. Enrollment this past year, this is fall ADMs, by the way, was about 9,900 students. And then we go out 10 years. And then because we're doing this extrapolation, we go out an additional 10 for a forecast of 20 years, okay? A couple things I want to point out here is that I have labeled the forecasts F and T, right? And so the reason I'm doing this and trying to make this distinction is F means it's the forecast. It's our forecast process where we have assumptions about births and housing. The T is the that means time series. That's our extrapolation. Okay, so we're not making assumptions like we've made for the first 10 years of the forecast. The time series forecast is something very different. We're just assuming trends are going to continue, and we're taking those numbers and we're extrapolating them out. So in terms of a 10-year forecast, this is consistent with our forecast process. Avon Schools would go from 9,900 students. Let me say that one more time. Would go from 9,900 students to almost 12,000 students over a period of 10 years. On the low side, that would be about 1965 in terms of number of students, and potentially on the high side with that high level of building at over 15,000 students. One thing that I look at when I look at these types of graphics, and I would encourage you to think about, is think about the the low forecast as a floor. Okay, so the low forecast, which again here is 9965, it's very unlikely total enrollment would go below that. All right, so it's basically, you can think about it as a floor. The only way we would anticipate that enrollment would go below that would be if housing really fell off. All right. The number of about 12,000, that would be your forecast number going out 10 years for total enrollment. The extrapolation here is taking the 20 years previous, so 2010 all the way to 2030, and then extrapolating that another 10 years. And so we're basically taking that trend and pulling it out into the future. What you could anticipate would be on the low side, 9,100 students, nearly 14,000 students at the base forecast, and over 20,000 at the high forecast. Now, before you take a big deep breath about that 20,000, let me just say that doesn't mean that 20,000 is a reasonable number. And this is why. And this is why we did the extrapolation, is if we assume that 8,000 single-family homes could be built out, the question is, where does that occur, and what would be basically a peak enrollment number? Okay, so at the high level, build out would occur in CY, meaning calendar year CY, calendar year 2030. That would impact enrollment, at least for the next 3 years, to 33, 34. And at the high level, that means 16,400 students. At the base, that's the same level as 8,000 single-family homes, but the timing of that is much later. So that's at 2032, and it impacts enrollment until 35, 36. What does that mean in terms of total enrollments? Just shy of about 13,000 students. At the low level, while building would occur and could continue to occur, it would not hit the build out levels whatsoever. Okay, so this is the updated enrollment forecast with the new assumptions. Let's next take a look at grade 9 through 12. So this would be your high school enrollment. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing. Year 2010, you had about 2,500 students. Last fall, so 2020, you had almost 32 or 30, you had 3,300 students. And the forecast would suggest over a period of 10 years, the base forecast with building at approaching 700 single-family homes a year, that you would be over 4,100 students in 10 years. Okay. Another way to look at this is, what about the low forecast? What if actually building fell off a little bit? It's very unlikely for your high school to be below 3,500 students. That means even with low levels of building, your high school is likely to grow. At very, very high levels of building, looking 10 years out, you're probably at, say, 5,500 students. One of the reasons why, for instance, at the low level, you still grow, your school is still going to grow, is because you have large cohorts coming through. You have large cohorts, kindergarten, first graders, sixth graders, seventh graders. I did some quick checks. I think your current sixth grade is somewhat large, if I remember, and that's a cohort that's getting very close to a graduating class when it graduates in 6 years, very close to 1,000 students. Okay, so what's happening is you do have large groups that are coming through, and they'll come through at the high school level, essentially whether or not there's building or not. If we think about build out, though, that's that second question. That's taking it out 20 years. So again, build out occurs in the high level at 2030 and at the base level at 2032. That means if the township was entirely built out at a very quick pace, enrollment at the high school level, at the high level, would be about 6,000 students. At a little bit accelerating pace from where it is now, build out would bring your enrollments at the high school to about 4,600 students, and that's the base. Again, it would never occur at the low level. We're doing the same activity or that same type of process for grades 7 through 8. So at grades 7 and 8, you're at about 1,400 students 10 years ago. Today, a little bit over 1,600 students, and that again is fall numbers. And looking out 10 years, we would anticipate enrollment to be about over 2,000 students. Again, at the low level, very unlikely for enrollments to fall from where they are now, even with lower building, and at the high level could approach 2,800 students at about 2030. Now, what about those build out levels? Well, at the high, if assuming a very quick build out, that would bring enrollments to about 3,000 students in the year in your school year 33-34, and would at the base level would bring you to about 2,200 students in the school year 35-36. Again, does not occur at the low level. And grades 5 through 6, 10 years ago, you were over 1,300 students. Last fall, you were 1,564. And if current patterns and trends continue, you'd be at about 1,800 students at the 5-6 level in 2030. Again, looking at the lower level or the low forecast, enrollments might fall a little bit if housing falls, but essentially when I look at something like that, a period of 10 years, that looks like a fairly stable enrollment. At the high level, potentially could be over 2,400 students with a very fast level of building. Now, build out occurring at the same time frames like before. At the high level with a full build out at a high forecast, we're looking at 2,600 students at 33-34, and we're looking over 2,000 students at the year 35, school year 35-36. And finally, K through 4, your elementary school students. Elementary school 10 years ago, 2010, you were at about 3,300 students. Last fall, you were almost at 3,500 students, and the enrollment forecast has your elementary at 3,900 students in 10 years. At the high level could potentially be 4,600 students, and this is where building does really impact elementary enrollment, and potentially be a little bit below current levels if home building kind of fell off, if it basically cut itself in half or went down 50% over a period of 10 years. At build out levels, your elementary enrollment would be about 4,600 students in year 33, 34, assuming 8,000 single family homes built out. And at the base level, looking at probably about 4,200 students in the year or school year 35, 36. One thing that is available in the packet, which I have also updated, is there's this summary table, but later on in the packet, there's also single age group, single grades. So you could actually take a look at the individual grades and see how they grow through time. So for instance, taking a look at grade 6 in the current school year and seeing how that cohort grows and becomes a graduating class of almost 1,000. I believe it's about 870 right now. Okay. That in a nutshell is my presentation for this evening.
Do you have any questions for Dr. Brudvig?
I have a couple of questions. Did she hear me? Dr. Brudvig,
Did you hear our board when they speak?
I can hear fairly well, and if I don't, if that could be put in chat for me by typed into chat, I can work with that. Okay.
My first question is when the demographics are presented for all of Hendricks County, I wonder if Dr. Brudvig knows off the top of her head what percent of the total population of Hendricks County is Washington Township.
Off the top of my head, I don't know. Honestly, I've been waiting for the new census data, which is not available. So I don't know if that helps. I can certainly get that number for you.
And you talked about the census data not being available until, I presume that May 2020 is when census data would be available. You mentioned that with respect to births in 2020 being available in May. Is that when all the census data will be available for release?
No, I think I apologize if it was difficult to hear or if I misspoke. The May date is going to be birth numbers, and those are coming from the Indiana State Department of Health. The census data, the census was conducted, well, it's been conducted over a long period of time because it was a COVID census. That is supposed to be an as of date of April 20. And then, so it's conducted every 10 years. And there was a goal that data would be available. First data as actually goes for reapportionment. So that's the constitutional obligation of the Census Bureau, is to make sure that data is available for reapportioning the House of Representatives. Data users, like all of us, we aren't first in line. So Congress is first in line. And then a data then starts rolling out. They have been delayed. And I was hopeful we would start seeing some of this data, shortly after it starts becoming available for reapportionment. Often what happens is then at least we get a number of persons, and we get a number of voters, so people of voting age. So just by, we can do quick math and we can see how many children there are, right? So it's just total population minus the number of voters. I am finding very difficult to get a schedule. I'm finding it very difficult to find a schedule or release dates. And, the census actually went through, I think it was October of this year, that they were still collecting data. So I do believe we'll see it. I just don't believe we're going to see it really, really quick. There are estimates, but the estimates are based on 2010 census. So at this point, I tend not to use it. I'll wait for even the COVID census numbers.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Board members, other questions?
Please correct me if I'm wrong. Through Zoom, this is always real clear for me. But it seems like as I extrapolate the numbers, the K4s over the next 10 years will only grow about 80 students per year, per grade per year. Is that correct?
So let's look really quickly here. I don't know if you can see my highlighting. Is this the numbers that we're talking about here?
I just want to make sure I understand. My goal is to not overbuild. So when I look at that tells me that unless, like you said, unless there is a major change in births or development, we are really going to kind of just go along over the next 10 years, and the move-ins is what's really going to drive our numbers up. And am I inferring that, or is that what you see in your research, that what's driving like our high school to be where you're predicting is because of move-ins? I'm just trying to understand that, what's driving it, so I understand when that driver switches, or we could peak out.
Yes. So, even here on the base forecast, it's going up. Your ballpark number about 80 a year is correct, and so it goes up and it goes down, and we are coming off some lower home building, and we're coming off bursts that are going down. So it's basically two things working almost contrary to each other, right? Bursts going down, just start going down, or at least in best case flat, and home building going up. If we look also at the low, if you're thinking about, and if you're thinking about what's, I don't want to say the worst case, but the low case in terms of enrollment, one thing you can do is look at the low, and I look at the low as a floor. So if births go down and if housing goes down over time, is elementary going down? Yeah, a tad. It's going down a tad. It is going to go up to about 3,600, going out a little bit. But we are making strong assumptions, though, about births as well as housing. I would also say we haven't made any clear assumptions about turnover in existing housing. And, that's, you all know your community a lot better than I do. And we do know what occurred in Wayne Township when there was turnover in housing, when they were built out. Their enrollments went up. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but we have seen it, and you've seen it in a neighboring township. So I think it's something to be aware of, right? And COVID times are COVID times. We now really don't know. But you do know that there's demand for housing in your township.
Right, and there is a real appetite for developers looking for land. Of that. And like you said, in my opinion, I feel like COVID still has brought about a variable that we can't get our hands around. Yeah. Well, I think it's important that we continue to have this discussion. I think there'll be a lot more information in 6 months, 9 months, a year, And that's why sometimes I kind of pull myself back when I think about, well, we got to really figure out the high school. When I don't know that we have enough information with because of COVID. I think what you have presented is extremely accurate. And obviously, I mean, you were within 24 students of your prediction 2 years ago. And then, if I remember right, you predict 5 years before that, you came back, which would have been 2 years ago, and you were still within probably 20 students. So you're extremely accurate, and it's honestly just amazing to me. I just worry about that bogey, if you want to call it, COVID, and I want to be able to make the best decisions going forward, especially at the high school. But I fear that the elementary through 4 is only growing 80 students. At what point do we start seeing declines?
Yeah, and so I just moved ahead to slide 24. Now, I know you've seen an earlier version of this, and I said, oh, I didn't have these single grade slides in here, but I do have them in this packet. And so this is another way to think about your question, I think. Am I talking to, was it Anne? So, you know, for instance, I think I mentioned grade 6 being there it is, it's over 800 students. So that's another way just to ballpark this question and this, you know, what's going on here. Historically, your grades have grown, you know, COVID or no COVID, you've added students over time and your cohorts have grown. So we can, if it'd be helpful, I could even give you some historical information when there was a little bit lower building than what there is today. And you can follow a cohort over time and essentially watch it grow. And if that gives you some confidence, I think about it this way. The first thing, the most important thing that is going to affect your enrollment is the students you have today. Right? I can show you the scenarios of births and housing, but what's going to affect your enrollment tomorrow, 5 years and 7 years are the students you have today. And we also know that over time in your township and Avon Schools, those numbers tend to grow.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I kind of want to second what Ann said, and it's not more of a question, it's more of a request. And I'm also second what Ann said, that this work that you present to us is incredibly helpful. I just cannot thank you enough for the detail and the specificity that you provide us. We have, just to be very blunt, we have a very difficult decision about the high school to make in the next couple of years. It is close to full. We can make changes in it to get through the short term, but if we're going to 4,000, it won't hold that many kids. So as you get your May data and your COVID data, and as you move forward and we can rely on you, my request is think about that as the specific problem we have to solve. And so if we can focus on that and you can use the tools that you have to say, this is what I know and this is where the guesses are, that's what we need in the next year to 18 months as we try to figure out what, if anything, needs to happen to the high school to prepare for this growth.
Yeah, and you know, I would say that while my forecasts have been fairly accurate, and I do pride myself on doing the best job I can, my forecasts in general, especially in a growing school district, tend to run low. And it's not just Avon. I've worked, oh gosh, I've worked in Clark Pleasant for almost 20 years. And at one time they were the fastest growing school district in the state. And every 2 years it came back because they needed to stay on top of their enrollments. And every 2 years my enrollments were low. And the nature of the methodology is that you're always kind of, I don't want to say chasing, but you're waiting for the numbers kind of to all catch up with each other. And so I tend not to force things, you know, I don't want to make up a number. I want the data to speak, but I know that in general, my methodology is inherently conservative when in growing times, and will be an overestimate in down times or slower growing times. So for you all, even though the total has tended to be very good, and that's my experience in other school districts too, and you know, part of it is because you already know the students you got are going to be the students you have in the future, is that at higher grade levels, in particular at the high school, I have been low in terms of the forecast. And so I say this to you because I know this is how statistically and the methodology works, as well as my experience in other school districts, fast-growing school districts like Clark Pleasant, or comparable school districts, I would say like Center Grove. I've worked for Center Grove for quite a bit on and off, as well as Mount Vernon. So probably very comparable to you in terms of the building and the type of building in particular that's occurring now. I personally believe and professionally believe that, you know, I'm looking at these numbers. This is the high school right here. I clearly see 4,000 here. I don't think it's a question of if, maybe it's a question of when, right? Because building, you know, like I said, it's not always the level of building, it's when it occurs. And that's almost a truism. So is it in 5 years or is it in 8 years? When I'm looking at this, I see 4,000. It doesn't matter if it's in 5 years or in 8 years, because this number is not precisely correct, but it is directionally correct. Everything is pointing in that direction. I would also say the housing forecast that I've provided you is also high, right? It's higher than it is today. So where will it be? A little bit higher, a little bit lower, but directionally we're on a path to 4,000.
Very helpful. Other questions, board members? With that, Dr. Brudvig will say a hearty thank you for once again providing us with a lot of food for thought, a lot of good information. I appreciate your work and thank you for joining us tonight.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so let me move us to the next agenda item.